This panel consists of community leaders, a Jewish, a Christian, and Muslim community leader. We're going to ask them now to speak to us about Jerusalem and community and involvement. You're on, my friend.
So,
you may speak from either here or from the podium, whatever.
Where are you guys going to speak from?
Podium.
Oh. All right, I'll speak from the podium.
Compromise right from the very beginning. Yes.
So I need to start by saying that I'm not sure that I'm a community leader.
You are today.
Yeah. And partially because I think the leaders of my community and the leaders of so many communities are really not leading us in the right direction. So I wish I was more of a community leader just so I could point this in the right direction. I'm going to talk very personally. I'm not asserting any primacy to my experience, but I'm going to talk about my experience, just sort of offering something as part of this circle of sharing. My earliest memories of Jerusalem are through songs, lots and lots and lots of songs. Probably the earliest song that I remember we'll sing in 2 nights, which is Next Year in Jerusalem, literally, Next Year in Jerusalem. Today when I sing that song, I have a sort of a mixture of feelings. I have some sadness, I have some longing, I have some discomfort. Jerusalem is today not what it was when I was a young boy. It's complicated, it's full of conflict, and I'm very conflicted. My next memory of Jerusalem was after the 1967 war. Seeing the photograph of the soldiers at the Western Wall, which we called the Wailing Wall, brought up all kinds of feelings and triumph and pride. And I say that now with more than hesitation. I say that with, like, I'm almost a little embarrassed, but that was my experience back then. And I know that that experience was very, very different than the experience of so many others, especially of Palestinians at that time. And I didn't know. And after that war, we sang a song called Jerusalem of Gold. In fact, on the way here, I called my mother and said, I'm coming to talk about Jerusalem. And she started singing, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. Is everybody going to sing that song? It was the world we lived in, that kind of bubble that we lived in. And it felt like we were coming home. It was very, very real. The first time I was actually in Jerusalem, I think I've been in Jerusalem almost 100 times. And the first time I was there was a year later in 1968. I was 14, my family was on a sabbatical, my father was on sabbatical. We didn't go to Jerusalem much, but I do remember the one time we went and we saw the Western Wall with the Golden Dome above it, and I felt very small. I didn't feel very much, but I did feel very small. And then a few years later, in 1971, I spent my first year of college there. And I studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem on Mount Scopus. And from the roof of my dorm, I could look out over the old city and the new city. And I remember walking down from Mount Scopus through Silwan Valley, walking alongside Palestinians on Palestinian streets, walking into the old city and feeling safe and feeling excited. It was an adventure. It was my first year of college. You know, I grew into myself as a young man. I had this intense excitement of being away from home by going home. And it was, it was just amazing. I was surrounded by these beautiful hills and these stone houses, and Yom Kippur was full of Jews and no cars. And it was just like, I was just happy and peaceful. And for 5 summers after that, I led teen groups to Israel. And every summer we went to Jerusalem. We made our pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. And we sang Hebrew songs on Friday nights. And we walked through the Hasidic neighborhoods where everything seemed eerily familiar, even though we had nothing to do with Hasidim. And there were Arabs, but they weren't yet Palestinians to us. We didn't know. They lived in another part of the city. We never visited them. Maybe when we circled the walls or we walked through the shuk to get to the Western Wall, maybe then we had some idea, but otherwise it felt just very, very Jewish to us, very, very much like we were in our history. One summer, one of the girls in the teen group had a nervous breakdown at the Western Wall. And she was a child of survivors like I am. And I remember feeling her falling apart in that shadow of the wall. And it was a kind of reminder that however glorious, the pain of our history was never very far away. A few years later, as a graduate student, I returned to Jerusalem. I lived in poor Jewish neighborhoods. I worked with Jewish immigrants. Then I started traveling around the country, and I would go to villages, Palestinian, Israeli villages, and do workshops. And I went to Peace Now rallies, and I listened to Jimmy Carter after the signing of the Camp David Accord on the radio. And it was a time of great, great hope. And one of my most vivid memories of that year was driving through Jerusalem at night, late at night, driving around the old city, listening to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, with the volume as high up as I could. And I felt like I was flying through the holy city. And then I remember going the next day or a few days later to the old city and playing backgammon with old Palestinian men. And it was like the most natural thing in the world to do. I was still very naive. I was very political, but I was still very naive. Maybe a little less naive than I had been a few years earlier. That was the last time, that year, the last time that I was in Jerusalem as a resident or as a tourist. Because after that, I started working in organizations that brought me to Jerusalem. I ran a progressive foundation for social change. I worked for Peace Now. I worked to get support for the Oslo Accords. And I was there in very exciting times, and I was there in very scary times. The first Intifada in the late 80s, the Gulf War in the early 90s, the second Intifada at the beginning of this century. War and peace seemed to alternate like night and day. On one evening in Jerusalem in 1991, Peace Now and the leaders of the Palestinian National Movement, because the PLO was still outlawed at the time, held an action, a Hands Around Jerusalem. 5,000 of us, and there were Palestinian flags and rubber bullets by the Israeli police. But more than anything else, there was a sense of hope and solidarity. And I get very sad when I think about that moment, but it still gives me a little bit of hope. Another time, 1995, just a few years later, I went to Jerusalem for the funeral of Yitzhak Rabin. And it was maybe one of the saddest moments of my life. There was some hope because Bill Clinton spoke, and Hosni Mubarak spoke, and King Hussein spoke. And even a few days later, Yasser Arafat went to Leah Rabin's house for Shiva. So there was a little bit of hope, but little did I know how little hope there was going to be. Jerusalem had become mostly a political place to me. I would go there to meet with Knesset members and analysts, some of whom knew what they were talking about, some of whom had no idea what they were talking about. But the city started to sour for me. After the first Intifada, it felt less safe to me. And ultra-Orthodox Jews were taking over the city. And I resented them, not only for taking over the city, but for taking over Judaism. And Jerusalem just didn't seem like home anymore. And I remember one Friday evening as the Sabbath was beginning, and a couple of my friends said, let's go down to the wall and pray Friday night. So I said, okay, I'll go down, but I'll stand at the plaza in front of it. I don't pray in synagogues where there's a mechitza, where women and men are separated, are compelled to pray separately. So I said, I'm not going to go to. And they said, well, wait, it's the holiest place in all of Judaism. You should go. Make an exception. I said, no, that's exactly where you don't make an exception. You don't make an exception at the holiest place. That's where you have your principles. And I remember standing on the plaza, looking down at them, at the men praying on one side and the women praying on the other side, and feeling my religion slipping away in, of all places, Jerusalem. So fast forward to last week. I hadn't been to Israel in over 2 years. So it was a long time for me to have been away. I went to be with my friends and to be with others and to understand what was happening there. And I spent a lot of time in Jerusalem, although I have to admit, all of it were in neighborhoods that were either not religious or very left-wing. But I loved it. I loved walking through the neighborhoods. I loved driving through the winding roads. I loved it. It was like Jerusalem came back to me. And then on Saturday night, last Saturday night, driving back from Tel Aviv from the demonstration against Netanyahu, the missiles started flying. And it felt kind of like the Gulf War when I had been there. But mostly it reminded me about how fragile the region is, how fragile Jerusalem is, how fragile my feelings are. So I still have hope. I never lose hope. But it's not as simple as it was when I used to sing Next Year in Jerusalem. And maybe next time we can all sing that together and we can all go back together. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you. Gabriel?
Thank you.
Be sure to hold it close.
Yeah, thanks. I take my glasses off so I can see. My name is Gabriel Meyer. I'm, as a foreign correspondent for the National Catholic Register and for several Italian news outlets, I was stationed in Jerusalem throughout the 1980s. And then I was sent off to a peaceful assignment in a place called Yugoslavia. I didn't get out of there until 1997. Before my work as a journalist, I lived in the Muslim quarter of the old city as a recruiter for a pediatric clinic, the fabled Spafford Children's Center between Herod's Gate and Damascus Gate, right on the wall, that provided key medical and most importantly social work services in a neighborhood that underserved does not describe the situation in especially the Har Sadia where I was living and working. I've returned for substantial periods to the city since then, mainly researching my history of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, awaiting publication. And my last visit to the city was in 2018. With our focus on Jerusalem this afternoon, and in a tribute to my colleague in the last panel, I can't resist quoting a line from Yehuda Amichai as well, the great poet, one of the great poets of the city. In Jerusalem, everyone remembers that he has forgotten something. I'm going to speak in very, very broad terms, very general kind of terms, like bullet points really, particularly about the Christian communities in Jerusalem. There are similar issues that affect Christian communities throughout Israel, Palestine, but also, of course, in the region. But I want to focus my remarks on Christian communities in Jerusalem. Anyone who's ever visited Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in particular at Easter will be forcibly reminded of two things: that Jerusalem is the unique foundational city of Christianity, as we've heard in previous panels, that Christianity as a religion was founded on the basis of events that happened in Jerusalem. This is our city of origin, our place of origin, as the great writer Colin Thuban has written. The heart of Christianity is a place of execution and an empty tomb. That's a connection not without its paradoxes. In that Jerusalem, as we heard in the first panel, in that Jerusalem on which the Jerusalem on which future Christian hopes are pinned is not some revival in any form of the earthly Jerusalem, but on the bestowal of a heavenly Jerusalem, which makes our relationship with the geography just a little complicated. So it's perhaps why pilgrimage, for all its importance, especially to early Christianity and even later, did not become a pillar of Christian faith. Even the early church fathers had their doubts. St. John Chrysostom once wrote about pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He says, "I don't know why you people are traveling all this distance with all these risks to see a tomb that is empty." The second thing one cannot fail to notice about Jerusalem's Christians is that pilgrims and pilgrimage-related institutions aside, local Christian communities of Jerusalem are remnant communities, often of such small and vulnerable presences to be almost invisible to the outside world. The numbers speak, but so do the images. Just a quick run through of some numbers. In 1944, in 1944, the Christian population of Jerusalem constituted 15% of the population. In 1967, 12% of the population. Today, 2% of the population. Barely 16,000. I'm cutting because I'm standing next to Father Alexei. He was looking intently at me. The decline of Christianity in the lands of its origin, lamented now for many decades, and a topic of anxiety among Christians worldwide since at least the 1960s, is both the central historical problem Christianity faces in the region, and I would argue a factor in the descent of the Middle East into extremism, ethnocentrism, and violence. And I'll speak just a little bit about that later. The decline does not have a single cause, as some writers tend to like to underline. There's not a single cause. It has a very complex history. The decline began in the 19th century when, in the waning years of the Ottoman Empire, the region began to open up to the wider world, and it was easier for Christians to travel to Europe and to colonies of Christians in various places in the world. But it was profoundly affected by World War I. We all know about the Armenian genocide and the effect that that had on the Armenian communities, but many people don't know as much about things like the Chaldean massacres in 1915 and 1916 that decimated entire ancient communities in the Middle East, as Ottoman armies, or Turkish armies really, were being pushed back into Turkey as they went through the region. There were large-scale massacres of Christians wherever they went. So this was a particularly devastating time for Christians because it affected it eliminated whole historic communities. I would also mention in this context, just very briefly, that there are incredible tales in that period. One from the Palestinian village of Birzeit. It's a part of Birzeit tradition, is the story of the Turkish army going through Birzeit, asking the village elders to isolate the Christians. Of course, everyone looked the same, dressed the same. And the elders of Birzeit would not identify the Christians to the Turkish troops, and were the Mukhtar, the mayor of the city. Others were killed, one after the other, but none of the Muslims of Birzeit would identify their Christian neighbors to these hostile forces. So not only World War I, of course, but also the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the ISIS campaigns in Syria and Iraq, the Syrian civil war, and subsequent refugee crisis, just to name a few situations that have contributed to the decimation of the Christian population. In post-1967 Israel, especially after the creation of Israel's separation barrier in 2006, Christian communities find themselves under even more intense pressure from all sides, economic, social, and religious. With that, the pressures Christians often experience as a result of perennial Jewish and Muslim communal tensions. One of my dear friends in Jerusalem, a Greek Orthodox Christian, and I were taking a long walk in the Kidron Valley, which is between the old city of Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. And he couldn't resist pointing out to me, he says, well, you'll notice that Muslims are buried to the west on the slopes of the western slopes of the valley. He said, and then Jews are buried on the Mount of Olives on the eastern slopes of the Kidron Valley. And he pointed to the Christian cemetery in the valley floor. He says, you see, even in death, we are between them. And I pointed out to him that the legend that the Kidron Valley would be the scene of the last judgment, maybe even in eternity we are between them. I want to basically focus on when speaking about Christian communities in Jerusalem, we often speak about external factors, but I also want to talk a little bit about internal factors that I don't actually think receive much press, but that are really part of the drama that we're talking about this afternoon. In Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, the plight of Christian communities is often linked to historic tensions between local Christians and foreign pilgrims. We heard in an earlier panel about Egeria, the intrepid Spanish nun who traveled throughout the region. She talks about local Christians complaining in the 4th century that when pilgrims were in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that Latin and Greek sermons were preached before Aramaic sermons to the local population. So this is an old problem, that tension between the living indigenous community and foreign pilgrims and foreign pilgrimage establishments. This is, again, a set of issues that deeply shapes the reality of Christians in the Holy Land. Another issue, foreign control of holy places by churches staffed by foreign clergy, often with little or no input from local Palestinian constituencies. This has been a hot issue for at least 200 years, where shrines like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are run by the Brotherhood of St. James, the Greek Orthodox Brotherhood of St. James, with a very strong focus on Greek Orthodox identity, on Hellenic identity, and a refusal in some cases to allow Palestinians to be involved in the administration of these churches or to have any real input to what happens in their own churches. This has been a very significant issue for, again, a very long time. Pilgrims are often unaware that there are even local Christians present, looking on Israel as largely a series of sites, a series of holy places, and often with little or no contact with what Pope Paul VI called the living stones. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about one of the elements of the profile of Christian communities in the Middle East is that Christian thinkers in a variety of forms, have for more than a century advocated for secular, non-religious polities in the region, polities that would transcend the restrictions of traditional religious law, ones in which Christians as well as others could function as full participants. I'm thinking of so many political movements in the Middle East were really spearheaded by Christians in the hope that some kind of polity could be worked out that would allow all to participate fully in the political process. I'm thinking here of Michel Aflaq and the creation of the Ba'ath Party and other secular movements. Also, the strong Christian support for Fatah, for the political movement behind the PLO, because it had advocated secular solutions to the problems of Israel-Palestine. And also with that, promoting not only a political paradigm, but promoting cultures of reconciliation and justice within the region. There are Christians who are committed to remain in Jerusalem and in the region as a vocation. This is one of the things, very much a part of the spirituality that Christians understand who live in the region with all of its difficulties, that they have a vocation to be a witness to Christianity and to its roots in the Holy Land. And again, not merely to its history, but to its transcendence, to the Holy Land as a place of reconciliation. But economic and social pressures born of occupation, marginalization, and intolerance make this an ever more daunting prospect. It is fitting, I think, that one of the inventions of the Jerusalem Church, one of its signature traditions, is the devotional walk through the streets of Jerusalem known as the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, marking the events of the death march of Jesus to the cross. An appropriate metaphor, surely, for the tortured history of Christianity in the Middle East, a history which well may be characterized for its indigenous Christians as a progressive humiliation. It is not without reason, then, that the Christ of the traditional Stations of the Cross collapses repeatedly under the weight of his task. I'm going to end just with a shameless quote from my own book. On medieval maps, Jerusalem was the center of the known world, the center around which the planets of shrines in Europe and Asia assembled themselves, and to which its pilgrims gravitated, the center of dreams, the paradise of last resort, this side of the borders of eternity, where anything was possible. But as always pitched on the roof of paradox, Jerusalem, for Christianity, city of its foundation, it was built not in the first place on a promise of celestial bliss, but on the passion of Christ, on a brutal execution and an empty tomb. That tension between heavenly promise and earthly crucifixion has informed the fate of the living churches of the region, survivors of a millennium and a half of brittle triumphs and durable defeats, to which modernity and modernity's wars have been merciless, but which are still alive to guard the holy fire of the heritage of Christianity's vibrant, if contentious, youth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. And last but certainly not least, Aziza.
Thank you.
You can need this as well.
Sounds good. Thank you. And what an evening, afternoon this has been, and what I hope that it continues to be. Whew, in these hard times, I call them hard because I know that my life is not anywhere near the realities that other people are enduring right now. But I call them hard. I find myself leaning into tradition more than I have before. And so I want to greet you the proper Muslim way, which is to say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace and God's blessings and mercy, compassion, be upon you. All of them. You know, Jonathan, when you started and you said that you can't make the exception in the holy space for your values or to let go of your principles. If there's one thing I hope we can walk away with today, it's that reconnection and affirmation to our principles and our values as human beings. And I'll come back to that. But I keep hearing excuse after excuse, and I call them excuses because I'm just going to call them what they are. We say somebody has to do something for us to be good. Yeah, that's kind of not the way it works. We are good because we are called to our values as human beings who believe in the values that we have actually spoken. And I think all of us, just like King asked in his final book, Chaos or Community, who we are. Who are we in this moment? I am the daughter of a Palestinian man from this little tiny village called Litbab, which is kind of outside of Jerusalem. It's in the Latrun area. It's by a place called Nevi Shalom, Wahid Salam, the Oasis of Peace. When you look over it, it actually means the land of many domes because there's little tiny hills all around. It almost has this, I don't know, like this mystical mist that kind of is around it, or at least it did in the morning when I saw it in the fall of 2012. Sorry, it was actually just 2 years ago when I went with my brother to go back. Because the way I have known Jerusalem, and my mother is very important. My mother is from the Midwest, and she is Midwestern and Episcopalian. And I lived in Jordan. That's where I grew up, in Amman. These two parents of mine who decided to raise us as Muslim children. And Jerusalem was the place where my cousins who lived in the United States, who are from my dad's side, came back to Jordan, and where I thought that they were crazy because that's the place they would go and visit, because in Jordan, as people who live there, I know Dr. Subha actually went when he was young. We didn't. Because it was further away than America was, which is where I would come and spend my summers. But Jerusalem is the place where these cousins of mine would come, and they would always come back with these stories about Litbab, but about Jerusalem. Before they started anything, they'd always talk about how they were strip searched at the border and what that experience was like. And I always be like, why would you put yourself through that? But that was just what you did in order to get there. It was just what you did. And then I think of my friend whose family goes 700 years, literally. She traces her lineage back to Jerusalem. And her mom was from Nablus, and her family's history goes even further back than the 700 years that her dad does in Jerusalem. And when they would go back and forth from Amman, because she would visiting extended family and go back, again, the stories of when she was young, when she was 3 years old, it's one of her first and her earliest memories. And she said, she remembers being in this room with her mom, and her mom was like, okay, like, just do what the soldier said. And she's like, no, it's a cold room. I'm not taking off my clothes. And she says, and the mom snaps at her and says, just do it. We've got to get moving. And so she complies, and she takes off her clothes, and she gets down to her socks and her underwear. And the soldier says, no, take off the socks too. And she like looks around, and she's like, the floor is dirty. It's cold and it's disgusting. I'm not taking my socks off. And her mom like shoots a glare and is like, you're going to do this. And so she does. She takes off her socks, and she's told to put them somewhere. And then the soldier's like, okay, you can take your stuff. And at that point, the girl was like, and when she tells the story, my friend tells the story, she has so much like that comes up for her. You can feel it and you can see it in your experience with her till this day. She's my age. And she's like, I took those socks and I threw them across the room. And I was like, I don't need those socks anymore. That's the energy that I know and that I remember. I think of Jerusalem the first time I went in 2005 with my siblings because my sister said, Khalas, let's go. And we went. And I remember my uncle, because he used to work for the United Nations, he would be going back and forth all the time. And he would talk about Jerusalem as this place that was so holy that you could feel the holiness as you walk through the city. And so in 2005, I'm there with there's 4 of us siblings, and we're walking through Jerusalem streets, the beautiful cobblestone uneven streets. And I remember feeling like, okay, where's the holiness? And I felt nothing. Nothing. I walked into the Dome of the Rock, the one where the rock, right, and the ascension into heaven. And I remember going down and put my hand on the rock and I started to feel this energy and I just started crying. I don't know where the energy came from, but I cried and I cried and I cried. And with time, I realized it's not that I wasn't feeling. It's that I was so angry at anyone who just prescribed holiness to hurting another human being in the name of holiness that I couldn't feel anything. I actually became my anger and I was living with it. It became a barrier to my own ability to connect with anything or anyone, but especially this special city. And finally, in the fall of 1.5 years ago, I went back to Jerusalem. And this time, I was at the top of the Dome of the Rock, and my cousins had said, listen, Aziza, it's not just important that you pray in the mosques, because there's the 2 mosques that we heard about earlier, but it's just pray outside in the plaza area. The whole area is holy. And so that's what I did. I prayed outside, and I felt the breeze dance around me. And it's not something I could ever describe to you. But I know that I felt something different. I felt something that felt possible, that we could not only connect back to our faith traditions in love and in connection to the holy, but that we could also create that space of belonging for others around us. And it's different, like when you were talking about belonging, Dr. Sabah, and like Jonathan, when you were talking about next year in Jerusalem, I remember, so I know I didn't mention this earlier, but I lead a Muslim Jewish organization. And the whole idea is that we need to be able to bridge the divides that threaten our democracy's well-being. And we need to do it through having hard conversations like the first panel started. But I remember being in more than one synagogue because people were incredibly generous during the high holidays. And they would say, next year in Jerusalem. And the first time I heard it, I shook with, I don't know, but it hit me at the core. And it made me so deeply sad somehow. It's like, this actually means so much to these people and all these different people that I was visiting. And so knowing something that it's other people have also belonging to a place and actually feeling it are 2 separate things. And the way we get out of those things is by actually showing up to them over and over and over again and finding a way together. And so as you walk forward in the days ahead, I hope you get out of your head and do a little bit more connecting back to your heart, connecting back to the essence of the traditions that we've ascribed to, that we follow, that we talk about, and that it's all of it. It's not just the beautiful stories. It's not just the hard stories. It's all of them. Because as we are coming back to what I mentioned earlier about our values, like I've heard this many times because when I've told the story about how in Islam we believe that God breathes of God's own breath into the human, and that means that God's divine breath is in every single one of us. And when I have said that, my friends from other traditions say, that sounds very familiar. And so if we truly do believe that God's breath is in every single one of us, What does that mean for our actions and the way we start behaving and acting with one another? Peace isn't it's not just a concept that we talk about in our scriptures. It's something that we actually have to live with step by step and day by day. And I know that sometimes we talk about high ways of doing things, but the piece that I see that keeps missing over and over again is listening. I think sometimes we say that we believe in it, but being quiet doesn't mean that we're listening. And if we really lean into it, there's something incredible that can happen. It's hard still. These days, it's especially hard. I'd like to ask you to listen to 3 podcasts today. Maybe not today, over the course of the next week. One is called The Hidden Brain, and it says, "Are you listening?" It's fairly recent. But what they show is like through one science study after the next, there's something that happens when we get triggered. So when we get triggered as human beings, we might believe that we are, arguing, and we're arguing in the best possible way, and we're calling towards the thing that we care about in the best possible way, but something else happens. Our minds start to narrow in such a way that it almost becomes impossible for us to come across as thoughtful respondents. And it takes an enormous amount of willpower to be grounded in the way that we are reflecting back to one another so that we can actually reach the goal that we want, which is to get the other person to hear what it is that we want them to see. But it takes an enormous amount of will to be able to get to that point. And really, it's a discipline. The second podcast, actually both of them come from, The Daily, it's based on the New York Times. You can find both of these. But connecting to what was said earlier about power of storytelling, I think it doesn't just connect to storytelling. I think we actually have to listen to the hardest stories to hear. Because I see plenty of people consuming a lot of media. But it's clear that we're not also seeing other pieces of the stories that we actually need to also be listening to. And so one of those stories is called, sorry, I can't read my handwriting. So it's on the Daily, and it's delivery and the growing threat of famine in Gaza. And it talks about Ghada, who towards the end of this series, end of this podcast episode, and she's Gaza's first solar scientist, and she's actually amassed a number of awards that have actually come with some financial awards as well. And towards the beginning of October, after everything it was clear that they needed to take care of or to buy food because they were really worried. She literally took all of her award money and she bought food and she put it in the house. She has 8 of them, siblings, and 2 parents. And so she really stocked the entire house with food so that they could make it through, because this is Gaza's 5th experience with something like this, though not to this magnitude. And so what Ghada did was the person who was interviewing her said, so then what happened? And she said that they tried to stay. They lived in northern Gaza, and they tried to stay for as long as they possibly could. And then eventually some soldiers came, literally the violence was at their doorstep, and the soldiers forced them out of their house. They had to leave, and since then they have moved 12 different times. So the soldiers set up in their house and for 2 weeks, and then so they had moved down to southern Gaza. And when they went to southern Gaza, then they realized that they actually weren't safe there as much either, and they started making their way up north so that way at least they could be close to their house. And then when they went eventually back to their house, it had been fully burned down and all the food was gone. And then the reporter asked her, she's like, well, how are you actually surviving? There's no food and supplies. And she said, we're taking feed from animals, anything that we can get, hay, whatever it is, and we grind it down into a paste to create bread. And yes, it makes our bellies ache and they hurt, but it's also the way that we're surviving. And I encourage you to listen to the entire episode. The second episode that I need you to listen to, and that we need, as a society, we all have to listen to these, is Hamas. It's also the Daily. Hamas took her and still has her husband. That's the title. Hamas took her and still has her husband. It's a story of a woman who lives in southern Israel, and her husband were deeply dedicated to the peace movement, even like before it became a big movement. They were actually part of the big force of it. And her husband was also taking people from Gaza and driving them to hospitals in Israel who needed help for medical procedures, and literally deeply committed. And on October 7th, they were, her husband was shot, but both of them were captured as hostages and taken into Gaza separately. And she talks about her journey and of loss. Her entire house was burned down, and she eventually got released as one of the hostages, but her husband is still being held. I think we have to hear these stories. We have to hear them. This woman's story, she says towards the end of it, she says, I still want to believe. I still want to believe. And I do believe that we still have to work together. It's hard. It's not just hard, it feels impossible. But we can't stay stuck here. I look at people ask me, how was your Ramadan? Actually, Ramadan was important because I was at least doing everything that I was supposed to be doing. Eid came, and in our tradition, for Eid, it actually says, you must rejoice. And I remember all my family emphasizing this, and I was like, I can't. But I put one foot in front of the other because I have 2 young boys and my husband, and we went to Eid prayers. And the sermon came, and someone told a story from the powerful story from the pulpit about a family and a father literally holding his 5-year-old baby girl, Reem, and literally crying, soul of my soul, please come. And I just remember my tears falling and falling and falling. And later on that day, I showed up to the thing I needed to show up to, but I couldn't by the evening. I know the stuckness. I feel it, and I feel it's very real. But I also know that the only times I actually feel slivers of hope is when good people step up and they do something together. And I know that we can do more than one thing together. One, we actually need to listen to stories, not to hurt ourselves, but just to be real about what's going on around us. It's not enough to just share the stories. We've got to do something. I think the one sliver that I've actually really felt was all the GoFundMe campaigns that I've been donating to started to finally send some updates, and they said, so-and-so made it out of Gaza. And that gives me something. And I know that the work is hard, but we have to be able to step into it together. And I'll end with this. Social scientists have shown, by studying groups of people in conflict, that the danger isn't when we have too little empathy. That's actually not the problem. The problem is that when we have too much empathy for one group of people, that is when we justify awful and heinous things towards another. We can do better, and it's the people. Also, social scientists, the same study, show that the people who can start to relate to others and help bridge and connect and start to understand and are willing to sit with, yes, we both hold Jerusalem as dear. We both hold sanctity of life as dear. And it's time we actually act like it.
Thank you, Aziza. Thank all of you. Actually, I think that was a beautiful summation of what we've been trying to do all afternoon. And